Marble is supposed to look clean when the sun hits it. In the Bellini Estate, it looked like judgment. Every afternoon, Beam turned the floor into a mirror. And there I was, on my knees, scrubbing my own reflection away like it didn't deserve to exist. The industrial cleaner Mrs. DeLuca insisted on using had eaten the skin off my knuckles. It stung the little cracks I'd taped over in the car that morning. The smell was sharp enough to make my eyes water, and it mixed with the house's constant perfume of old money. Leather from the couches, smoke that never quite left the curtains, and something colder, like metal hiding under velvet. I moved fast because speed was safety here. If you were quick, you stayed invisible. If you were invisible, you didn't get noticed by cameras that watched without blinking or by men in suits who stood like statues at the ends of hallways. I'd learned the routes that kept me out of their way. I'd learned how to keep my gaze down. I'd learned how to breathe quietly. I'd also learned how to count. Not the way they taught in school, but the way single moms count. 2 days until rent, 4 hours until daycare, late fees kick in. 1 prescription refill left before mom's insurance decided it didn't feel generous anymore. I kept a folded hospital parking receipt in my apron pocket like a warning. $27 for 3 hours, the kind of math that makes you hate numbers. My back ached from yesterday's double shift at the diner, and my sneakers were still damp from the walk-in. I told myself pain was temporary. Eviction was not. Neither was my daughter's face. Lily's drawing was in the other pocket, the one closer to my heart. She'd shoved it into my hand at breakfast with cereal milk on her chin, proud like she'd invented color. A stick figure me, a stick figure her, and a big sun with a smile. Under it, in crooked letters, she'd written, "We are okay." I'd stared at that note in the staff bathroom earlier and nearly lost it, because she believed me when I said it, and I needed to keep earning the right to say it. My phone buzzed once, the screen spiderwebbed from a drop last month, a voicemail notification from the oncology clinic. I couldn't listen. Not here. Not while bleach-bright floors reflected my fear back at me. Mrs. DeLuca's heels clicked before I saw her. She didn't hurry. People like her never had to. She ran the staff with a stare that could cut through bone, hair pinned tight, lips even tighter. She didn't call me by my name. She called me by my job, by my place. I felt her shadow stretch over me, and my shoulders tensed on instinct. She told me there was a spill in the master's office. Red wine on a Persian rug. Handle it immediately, before it set. The way she said master made my stomach drop. Dominic Bellini didn't just own the house. He owned the air in it. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath when he passed. I'd worked here 3 weeks, maybe 4, long enough to map the safest corners and short enough to still flinch at every slammed door. I'd only seen him from a distance, a dark silhouette moving through bright rooms, the kind of man who didn't step aside for anyone. His men moved with him, expensive suits hiding heavier things. You could feel the weight of weapons without ever seeing them. When he entered a room, conversations thinned into whispers. Mrs. DeLuca, who bullied everyone else, became careful. I'd watched her straighten like a soldier, like she was terrified of disappointing him. And I'd watched myself shrink, because shrinking is what you do around storms when you're holding a baby bird in your hands. My throat went dry as I gathered my supplies. Cloths, a bottle of neutralizer, gloves too thin to matter. I walked the hallway that led to his office and tried not to look at the framed photos, the trophies of a life that had never had to choose between groceries and gas. Halfway there, my mind tried to bargain. Maybe he wasn't inside. Maybe one of the guards would take the rug and send me away. Maybe I could go back to the marble and pretend this moment never happened. But the door was already cracked open, like it had been waiting for me. I paused with my fist raised, the knock barely a tap. My pulse thudded in my ears, loud as footsteps. For 1 second I thought about Lily's drawing, about Mom's thin hand in mine, about the fact that I needed this paycheck like I needed oxygen. Then a calm voice from inside told me to come in, like he'd been listening the whole time. His office swallowed sound the second I stepped inside. The light from the hallway thinned behind me, and the air turned dense with cedar, old leather, and smoke that never quite left. Mahogany framed everything, as if the room had been built to keep secrets. Under the smoke sat cologne, the kind that made my throat tighten. The rug took the hit for my first breath. It was thick, patterned, probably older than my family line, and red wine had opened across it like a fresh bruise. The stain spread quietly, sinking deeper, while I stood there holding rags and a bottle like they were an apology. I kept my eyes down, because that was the rule I lived by in this house. Staff stayed small. Staff did not look for trouble. I moved to the edge of the spill and knelt, letting my knees find the familiar ache of work. The cleaner in my gloves burned the cracks on my knuckles, and I welcomed the sting because it gave me something simple to focus on. Even without looking, I knew where he was. Dominic Bellini did not have to speak to take up space. The room leaned toward him. The silence felt trained. When I risked a glance, I saw him behind the desk, sleeves rolled, watch flashing when he shifted his hand. He looked less like a man doing paperwork, and more like a man deciding what deserved to exist in his orbit. I started blotting, careful and quick, but his attention landed on me anyway. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was precise, like a light turned on in a place I'd been hiding. I felt it travel from my cheap shoes to the taped fingers to the faint bleach on my cuffs. I felt it pause at the pocket where Lily's drawing was tucked, and my heart jumped like it had been called by name. I lifted my head because the pressure of his focus made it impossible not to. When our eyes met, it felt like stepping into cold water. His gaze held mine without warmth, without hurry, and yet I couldn't look away. He studied me as if I were a detail in a plan, something unexpected that could become useful. I hated that my breath caught. I hated that part of me wanted him to keep looking, just so I could prove I was real. Then the knowing began. He didn't ask questions like a normal employer. He revealed facts the way a man reveals locks he already has keys for. In the space of a few calm sentences, he laid out my double shifts, my second job at the diner, the way I ran from here to there like I could outrun debt. He named me as a single mom, and my stomach clenched because that wasn't something I'd ever said to anyone here. The micro detail was what did it. He referenced the daycare cutoff at 5:30, the exact time I'd been counting down to since morning. The time that decided whether I paid another fee I couldn't afford. And then he noticed the hospital wristband I'd shoved into my bag, the one with Trish Brooks printed on it in black letters. I hadn't even realized it was visible. Hearing my mother's name in his office made my skin go cold. A rush of heat hit my face, equal parts anger and shame. I felt exposed, like my life had been unfolded on his desk. I wanted to snap that he had no right. I wanted to gather my rags, stand up, and walk out. But I saw Lily's drawing in my mind, the crooked "we are okay," and I swallowed the protest because my pride didn't pay for chemo. The worst part was the flicker of relief that followed. I'd been moving through the world like a ghost for so long that being seen felt like a hand on my shoulder. It was dangerous comfort, the kind that comes right before you realize the door has closed behind you. I kept working, scrubbing the stain like it was the only safe conversation. At some point he moved, and the air shifted as he came closer, bringing that cologne and smoke with him. He didn't touch me, but his control wrapped around the moment anyway. He made it clear, in a calm that left no space for debate, that I was done starving myself for the sake of proving I could survive. He decided I would eat now. Not later, not when my shift ended. Now. And he made it, calling for Gabe Rossi to escort me to the kitchen like missing lunch was a security risk. I stood, gathered my supplies, and walked out with hunger twisting in my gut and humiliation burning under my skin. Gabe's footsteps behind me sounded like a lock turning. By the time Gabe Rossi guided me out of Dominic Bellini's office, my hands were still burning inside thin gloves. The cleaner had found every crack in my skin, and my heartbeat felt loud enough to set off the security cameras. I kept my eyes forward and my mouth shut. In that house, silence was how you survived. The hallway outside the office was polished and bright, like nothing ugly had ever happened there. Gabe walked a step behind me, not touching, not rushing. He didn't have to. His calm presence made the direction feel decided already. The kitchen hit me with warmth and real scent. Butter, garlic, roasted chicken. It should have felt like comfort, but the room was too orderly for comfort. A covered plate waited on the marble island beside a glass of orange juice, still cold enough to bead. The staff had cleared out, leaving that mansion hush that always made me think of places where you weren't supposed to be unless you were invited. Gabe took up a spot near the window where he could see the doors and the courtyard. He gave me privacy the way a guard gives privacy. By watching the perimeter, I could feel his attention without ever meeting his eyes. I lifted the cover and my stomach tightened so hard it hurt. Food that wasn't a granola bar crushed in my pocket. Food that had been chosen, plated, warmed, timed. I sat and started eating because my body didn't care about pride. The first bite tasted like relief, and that scared me more than the wine stain upstairs ever had. I chewed fast, then slowed down, embarrassed by myself. I hated that I was being monitored while I ate. I hated that part of me wanted to finish every bite before someone changed their mind. Hunger does something humiliating to you. It makes you honest. Somewhere in my apron, Lily's crayon sun pressed against my ribs. I could almost hear her voice asking if I'd eaten today. I wanted to tell her yes without feeling like I'd just traded a piece of my freedom for it. My brain tried to do what it always did and turn fear into a checklist. Lily's pickup was at 5:30. If I walked in at 5:46, they charged me a late fee I couldn't spare. She would be waiting on the little plastic chair by the fish tank, pretending she wasn't scanning every car that pulled up. Tomorrow was show and tell, and she'd asked me to sew the button back on her cardigan tonight. I'd nodded like time was something I owned. I told myself this forced break was about optics, about staff not fainting on marble, about keeping the house running smooth. A billionaire's version of workplace wellness. But the memory of Dominic's eyes in the office kept cutting through those explanations. He hadn't looked at me like an employee. He'd looked at me like a detail he intended to keep. Footsteps entered, and the room shifted. Dominic was there, close enough that his cologne threaded through the food smells. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He looked at the plate, at my hands, at the dark circles under my eyes, like he was reading a report only he could access. Without raising his voice, he made it clear this wasn't optional. Eating wasn't a suggestion, it was a rule now. The control in it was so clean it almost passed for concern. Almost. Then he mentioned Lily. Not in a general way. He referenced Little Steps Daycare, the exact place name I'd never said out loud in this house. He noted their pickup window like it was part of his schedule, not mine. He even pointed out that I carried Lily's emergency inhaler in the side pocket of my tote because the front zipper was broken. My throat closed around the bite I hadn't swallowed yet. I sat there frozen, realizing he knew my daughter's life down to the small panic details. The kind of details you only know if you're watching. For one heartbeat, his attention softened, and the softness was worse than the cold. It tempted me to believe this was protection. Then the certainty came back, firm and final, and he let the idea hang in the air that I was safer under his roof than anywhere else. When he left, he did it without drama. Like the kitchen belonged to him the same way the hallways did. Gabe stayed put. I finished the plate because my body insisted, but the relief tasted different now, like a bargain I hadn't agreed to. As I walked out, Mrs. DeLuca's earlier warning echoed in my head, sharp as bleach. Men like him didn't notice women like me for innocent reasons. I'd come in hungry. I left fed, watched, and suddenly terrified that safety might just be another word for captivity. By the time I set the fork down, the food sat heavy and warm in my stomach, and my nerves still buzzed like exposed wiring. Gabe stayed near the doorway until I wiped my mouth and stood, as if even digestion needed supervision. Mrs. DeLuca found me before I could return to the marble. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The message was simple. Mr. Bellini wanted me back upstairs. My throat tightened. My first thought was Lily. The clock in the hall said a little after 1, which meant I still had hours before 5:30. But my mind snapped straight to pickup, to that plastic chair by the fish tank, to the late fee that hit at 5:45 like a punishment for being poor. I followed the corridor again, cleaning caddy bumping my leg, shoes squeaking softly on stone. I passed a camera tucked in a corner molding, and felt my shoulders pull inward. My cracked phone vibrated in my pocket, and for a second I feared it would be the clinic. I couldn't afford another voicemail I didn't have the courage to hear. Dominic's door was open. The wine smell still lived in the room, sweet and sharp, threaded through smoke and leather. The Persian rug looked better, but the stain had left a faint shadow, a reminder that some things never fully come out. I stepped inside and the silence closed behind me like a seal. He didn't waste time with small talk. He watched me the way he had earlier, like he could count my heartbeats and decide which ones mattered. I felt the power imbalance in my bones. I was still in an apron. He was behind a desk that looked like it had never known panic. He laid the situation out in practical pieces, the way a man talks about repairs. My mother's diagnosis, the treatment plan the doctors wanted but insurance wouldn't cover, the hospital administration that liked to delay and deny. He said he had already spoken to the oncology coordinator, already secured a consultation for next Tuesday at 9 a.m., already arranged the deposit the clinic required before they'd even order the meds. He mentioned a driver would take me there, and that the billing office had been instructed to stop calling my number. Then he produced an envelope, thick, plain. He set it on the desk like it belonged there. When I opened it, the cash stared back at me in clean stacks. $8,000. Enough to cover rent, the daycare balance, the last copay that had bounced, and maybe the next month of groceries without ramen math. My lungs forgot how to work for a beat. Gratitude hit like oxygen, sharp and immediate. Right behind it came humiliation, hot and choking. The money felt like a collar I was being asked to fasten myself. I thought of Trish's wrists, how small they'd looked under the hospital sheet. I thought of Lily's drawing in my pocket, her son smiling like she trusted the world. He described the arrangement without ever calling it that. He would cover the treatment. He would handle urgent costs. In return, I would stop disappearing. I would move into the East Wing, a suite prepared for me, so I was under his roof, under his rules. Honesty would be mandatory, the kind that leaves no room for secrets or quiet exits. Security would accompany me anywhere off the property. He would know where I was. It was framed as protection, but every detail sounded like containment. I felt anger rise, not at him alone, but at the corner my life had backed me into. If I refused, Trish might die waiting for paperwork. If I accepted, Lily's life would be tied to a man whose kindness felt like surveillance. I stared at the envelope and tried to see my choices clearly, and all I saw was one path where my mother lived, and one where I buried her. So I did the only brave thing I could do in a room that belonged to him. I negotiated. I made my voice steady and told him the treatment could not depend on my obedience, my feelings, my ability to endure his control. If whatever this was between us went wrong, if I ever had to leave, my mother's care had to continue, guaranteed, in writing, no games. For the first time, his expression shifted, not toward anger, but toward something like approval. It was subtle, the kind of reaction that would have been missed by anyone who wasn't watching for danger. He liked that I pushed back. He expected it, and that realization landed harder than the money. He hadn't just noticed me. He had planned for me. I left Dominic Bellini's office with the envelope still open in my mind, even after I'd handed it back. My legs carried me down the hallway, but my thoughts stayed upstairs, pinned under his approving look. It wasn't relief I felt. It was adrenaline, the kind that makes you want to run, and also makes you walk carefully, so nobody notices you're shaking. All I could think about was Lily, about how every choice I made now would land on her small shoulders. By the time Antonio's car pulled up outside my apartment that evening, the sun was already low, and my stomach had gone tight again. I climbed the stairs like I was carrying a secret that could break glass. Inside, my place looked exactly like my life, small, loud with clutter, and always half-finished. I opened the closet and started making piles on the bed. What we needed, what we could carry, what we'd regret leaving. 2 bags. That was the whole plan. Lily's sneakers, the ones with the frayed Velcro, went in first, then her school folder with spelling lists and a crumpled permission slip. I packed her inhaler, her little bottle of bubblegum-flavored medicine, and the tiny thermometer I'd bought at a gas station at 2 a.m. My own things were easier because there were fewer of them. 2 pairs of jeans, 1 worn hoodie that still smelled like home, and a stack of hospital receipts I couldn't stop saving. I found Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit under the couch, ears bent from years of being dragged through every hard season. When I set it on top of the clothes, my hands shook so badly I had to sit. Lily watched me from the doorway, hugging her pajama shirt to her chest, trying to understand why I was moving fast without smiling. Her questions came in those soft, curious bursts kids use when they're scared but don't know the word for it. I answered with the same lie I'd used on myself all day. This was temporary. This was for Grandma. This was going to be okay. I didn't tell her about Dominic, or the way his attention felt like a spotlight that could burn. I just smoothed her hair, tucked the rabbit into her arms, and promised we'd have our own little corner wherever we went. The ride back to the estate felt like crossing a line on a map that no one warned me about. City blocks blurred into darker roads, and the farther we went, the more my instincts started scanning for exits. Motherhood does that. It turns fear into a flashlight you can't shut off. When the Bellini gates rose, tall iron bars sliding apart, Lily leaned forward in her seat like she'd spotted a castle. Then the guard's flashlight swept the car, the badge scanner beeped, and her excitement faded into a quiet that made my chest ache. She didn't need guns to sense danger. She felt it in the way men stood too still. Inside, Mrs. DeLuca met us with a look that said I'd tracked mud onto marble, even though my shoes barely touched the floor. She directed staff with clipped efficiency, and her eyes kept cutting to Lily like my child was an inconvenience that breathed. Dominic appeared without announcement, and the foyer seemed to rearrange itself around him. He didn't crouch or coo or pretend. He simply looked at Lily the same way he'd looked at me, measured, attentive, weighing. Lily held the rabbit tighter and stared back, brave in the blunt way kids are when they decide they won't be moved. I watched Dominic's restraint and felt 2 opposite things at once: relief that he was careful, and terror that careful meant calculated. Without asking, he had already decided where we'd sleep, what Lily would eat, how security would shadow the halls, as if logistics were a language only he spoke. Our suite in the East Wing was too big, too quiet, and my 2 bags looked like a joke in the center of it. I helped Lily wash up, lined her shoes by the door like we might need to run, and read her a story with my voice steadier than my hands. When the lights went low, she curled against me, and I felt the weight of what I'd done settle into my bones. In the dark, her whisper came like a confession she didn't know she was making, and it sliced straight through my excuses. She said, in the simplest child way, that Mr. Bellini scared her because he didn't get loud. He stayed quiet, like the room listened to him. I lay there after she drifted off, staring at the ceiling, realizing my daughter had named the truth I'd been dodging. Tomorrow, this house would try to dress me, shape me, teach me how to belong, and Lily would be watching with those wide, careful eyes. That night I didn't sleep. Lily's breathing was the only steady thing in the East Wing, a soft rise and fall in a room too big for our 2 bags. I lay on the edge of the mattress, staring at the ceiling trim, listening to the house hum with quiet power. Somewhere a door clicked, somewhere footsteps moved, and I kept thinking, this place doesn't wait for permission. It reshapes you. At 6:30 a.m., I was already dressed in yesterday's jeans, hair twisted up, hands smelling faintly of bleach, no matter how much I washed. I checked Lily's forehead, tucked the rabbit under her chin, and set her inhaler where I could grab it fast. Then the knock came, polite, timed, inevitable. A stylist swept in with 2 assistants and a rolling rack that looked like a boutique on wheels. They spoke in low tones, glancing at me like I was a problem to solve. Boxes followed. Hangers, shoes still wrapped in tissue. Someone had measured me without touching me, and that thought made my stomach turn. The closet that had been empty last night filled in minutes. Dresses that shimmered, blouses soft as water, coats with tags that could have paid a month of daycare. They guided me toward the mirror and started doing what people do when they're paid to improve you. They pinned, brushed, dabbed, adjusted. I watched my own face as if it belonged to a stranger. The woman in the glass looked cleaner, sharper, expensive. She also looked quieter, like she'd learned to take up less room even while wearing more. They called it styling, but it felt like labeling. The emerald dress they chose hugged me in places I usually hid, and the heels changed my balance, forcing my chin up. I kept wondering if Lily would recognize me, or if she'd think I'd traded our old life for glitter today. I slipped back into Lily's room between fittings just to hear a normal sound. She blinked awake, confused by the unfamiliar curtains, and I coaxed her through the morning routine I'd always used. Bathroom, teeth, hair, breakfast. I kept my voice steady. I kept my promises vague. I told myself that if I could keep her schedule intact, I could keep her safe. By late afternoon, the house moved around me like I was cargo with a delivery window. Gabe stood outside the suite. Another guard waited by the stairs. Mrs. DeLuca appeared long enough to remind me where not to step, what doors were not mine, how staff should look at me now with a mix of resentment and obedience. It was social violence, clean and quiet. When Dominic finally appeared, he didn't ask if I was ready. He glanced once, approving, and the approval felt like a stamp. His hand settled at my back as we walked. Not quite gentle, not quite forceful, but certain. I hated how my shoulders relaxed anyway. I hated how protection could feel like relief. The restaurant wasn't on any public street. It sat behind a gate, lights low, windows dark. Inside there were no random diners, only men who looked up as if they'd been waiting. Their suits were perfect. Their smiles were not. Women sat beside them in polished silence, eyes moving over me like inventory. I felt the room weigh my dress, my posture, my usefulness. I felt myself become prey and prize at the same time. Dominic introduced me in a few controlled words I didn't repeat to myself, because repeating them would make them real. His touch stayed on me, a signal to everyone else that my body belonged to his protection. Territory was discussed in careful language. Names were swapped like chess pieces. A laugh here, a pause there, and underneath it all I heard the warning. Violence was always nearby, even when nobody raised a voice. I smiled when it was expected. I breathed through the heat in my face. I thought about Lily asleep back at the estate, guarded by men who would never call her sweetheart, only asset. When Dominic's fingers briefly tightened on my thigh under the table, I told myself it was a shield. I also knew it was a lock. The drive home was quiet. The estate gates opened like a mouth. Inside, the halls were dim, the air cooler, as if the house saved its warmth for people who had always belonged. Dominic walked me to the corridor and peeled away toward his office. I was grateful. I was furious at my own gratitude. I went to check on Lily, and on the way I heard it. Dominic's voice through a cracked door, low and hard. The calm finally sharpened into something else. I caught only a fragment, but it froze my blood. Someone was asking questions about Trish Brooks at the hospital, and Dominic was already deciding what would happen next. After the restaurant, I kept hearing the same thing on a loop, like a voicemail I couldn't delete. Someone had asked about Trish Brooks at the hospital. Not about Dominic, not about his money, about my mother. I lay in the dark while Lily slept, staring at the line where the ceiling met the wall, and I realized what I'd done. I hadn't just stepped into Dominic's world. I'd pulled Trish and Lily into his orbit, and in his orbit, everything became visible. Morning didn't feel like a reset. It felt like a countdown. I moved through the suite quietly, checking Lily's inhaler, smoothing her hair, making sure she was tucked in. I listened for footsteps outside the door and found myself cataloging them, the way you can tell a mail carrier from a stranger by rhythm alone. Motherhood had rewired my brain into constant vigilance. Every unknown was a threat until proven otherwise. When Dominic had me brought to him, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors. Gabe appeared in the hall with the same calm professionalism he always wore, and the message was delivered like a schedule update. I followed because resisting here never looked like a fight. It looked like futility. Still, as I walked, my mind raced through Lily upstairs, Trish in a hospital bed, and the fragile thin line between safe and gone. Dominic waited near his office, jacket off, sleeves rolled, expression focused in a way that made the air feel colder. He didn't touch me at first. He simply turned, and I felt myself fall into step beside him like the house expected it. He led me past rooms I'd already learned to avoid, down a corridor that smelled less like polish and more like stone. He stopped at a bookshelf I'd assumed was decorative. His hand slid along the spines, and a panel shifted with a soft click that turned my stomach. Cold air breathed up from the opening. The stairs beyond were narrow, the kind that forced you to watch your footing and think about how far underground you were willing to go. I hesitated for half a heartbeat, then pictured Lily's face and Trish's tired eyes. If this man was holding our future in his hands, I needed to know what those hands were capable of. Each step down changed the world. The luxury above became muffled. The silence gained a second layer, a deeper heartbeat beneath the house. I heard distant metal, the faint scrape of something moved, and voices that never rose, just pressed through walls like steam. The smell shifted too, less cologne and more disinfectant, like someone tried to keep control down here with chemicals and rules. At the bottom, Dominic guided me to a room that was plain in the most unsettling way. A chair, a man restrained in it, a lamp casting a hard circle of light. The man's name, I learned, was Evan Pike, and he looked like someone who'd made a mistake and been forced to sit in it. He wasn't bleeding all over the floor or anything like that, but his face was bruised enough to make my mouth go dry, and his eyes were wide with the kind of fear that doesn't ask for sympathy, only survival. My body reacted before my mind did. Nausea rose. My hands went cold. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run back to Lily, to wrap myself around her like a shield. I tasted panic, sharp and metallic, and I hated that Dominic had brought me here. I hated that some part of me needed to understand why. He explained what Evan had done, and the explanation landed worse than the sight. Evan worked around billing and records at the hospital, close enough to touch numbers that decided whether people lived comfortably or suffered quietly. He'd been skimming from a fund connected to my mother's care, manipulating limits, shifting charges, creating paper reasons for the pharmacy to deny medication. He planned to make it look legitimate, like Trish had simply reached a line on a form and needed to wait. A delay, a shortage, a policy, the kind of harmless words that can become deadly when you're weak. Rage pushed through my fear so fast it felt like heat. My mother could have died without anyone pointing a weapon at her. She could have faded because a man wanted to cover gambling debts and thought sick people were just columns on a screen. I imagined Trish waiting for a nurse, asking why her meds were late, trying to smile so I wouldn't panic, and I had to swallow hard to keep from shaking apart. Then Dominic made it clear this wasn't only about Evan. It was about me. He wanted me to decide what justice looked like. He watched my face like he was measuring whether I would collapse, beg, demand mercy, or demand blood. I understood in a flash that this was a test of my stomach, my values, my ability to live in his reality without becoming another liability he had to manage. I forced myself to breathe. I didn't want to watch anyone die. I didn't want Lily's mother to become someone who could stand in a basement and nod at execution like it was weather. But I also didn't want Evan near Trish ever again. I wanted him unable to touch another record, unable to quietly ruin another family. Dominic's decision came fast after mine. He didn't need theatrics. He needed outcomes. Evidence would be forwarded. Authorities would receive what they needed. Evan would be arrested through legitimate channels and disappear into a system that would keep him caged for years. The punishment would be real, and it would be clean enough to look lawful from the outside. When we climbed back up, the air warmed, but I didn't. Dominic told me, with the same calm certainty he used for everything, that I'd passed. I walked toward Lily's door afterward and realized the most frightening part wasn't the basement. It was the fact that I could stand in it, think clearly, and choose. Trish and Lily were the stakes, and somehow, that had already started changing me. When I came back upstairs from that hidden level, the carpet felt too soft under my shoes, like the house was trying to soothe me after showing its teeth. I checked Lily first. She was asleep on her side, one hand curled around her stuffed rabbit, breathing steady. Relief hit, then shame followed right behind it, because I'd started measuring safety in Dominic Bellini's terms. Threats removed, risks controlled, silence restored. I tried to wash the basement out of my mind with routine. Lunch packed, inhaler placed in the same pocket of Lily's backpack. A call to the hospital to confirm Trish's next appointment. But the aftertaste stayed. If Dominic could reach into hospital systems and yank a man out by his collar, then other men could reach in too. And they wouldn't be gentle. The first sign of escalation was the way the estate breathed. Guards shifted positions without being told. Radios whispered more often. The gates stopped opening with their usual lazy confidence and started snapping shut fast. Gabe Rossi walked the halls with his jaw set, scanning corners like he expected walls to move. No one explained anything to me, which was how I knew it was serious. By late afternoon, the name finally surfaced in fragments, carried by footsteps and half-swallowed Italian. The Carver Crew, a rival outfit with a grin for cameras and knives for back rooms. Something about a deal that went sour. Territory that didn't stay put. Pride that demanded payment. Vendetta. The word didn't need translation. It sat heavy in my chest, because vendetta meant targets, and targets meant children and mothers. Dominic came home after dark. I heard the front doors, then the low rush of men moving as one. When he appeared at the top of the stairs, my body went rigid. There were dark specks across his white shirt, scattered like someone had flicked paint. Not his blood, my mind insisted, and somehow that was worse. He looked at me once, sharp and assessing, and I knew he'd already counted the ways the Carvers could get to Lily and Trish. The crackdown started immediately. More cars in the drive, more boots on the stone, deliveries searched until even grocery bags looked guilty. Every window checked, every camera angle reviewed. Gabe's team doubled, then doubled again, faces I didn't recognize taking posts outside my suite. Lily wasn't allowed to wander the gardens. I wasn't allowed to step past the front steps without a full escort. The house didn't feel like a mansion anymore. It felt like a bunker with chandeliers. I told myself I'd agreed to an arrangement, not a siege. I'd traded my freedom for medical bills and breathing room. Yes, but I hadn't signed Lily up for whispered hallways and men with earpieces. My anger came out sideways. I snapped at staff for nothing. I cried in the bathroom where Lily couldn't hear. I counted exits in every room and hated myself for doing it, because counting exits meant admitting I might need them. The thought of running arrived the way panic always does, sudden and practical. I imagined a motel off the highway, a different name on the keycard. Lily watching cartoons while I called the hospital from a burner phone. But even in the fantasy, Dominic's shadow filled the doorway. His refusal, when it came, didn't feel like an argument. It felt like a wall. Leaving would make us easier to track, easier to grab, easier to break. Staying meant being locked in, but it also meant being surrounded by his machinery. That week stretched like wire. Dominic slept in fragments, if he slept at all, living on coffee and phone calls that turned his voice into a hard whisper. Men moved through corridors at 2:30 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., quiet but urgent, like the house had turned into a living map. I caught Italian words I couldn't translate, but I understood the emotion underneath them. Pressure, calculation, rage held in a fist. Lily felt it too. She followed me from room to room, asking with her eyes why the world had gotten so still. When she finally fell asleep, she clung to my shirt like it was the only safe thing left. On the 8th day, Dominic found me in the library, and the moment I saw his face, I knew the crisis had shifted, not ended. He told me the vendetta was lifted. Relief hit so hard my knees nearly gave out. I wanted to believe it meant the gates would open and the air would return to normal. Then I noticed his eyes. Not triumphant, not calm. Troubled, like he'd paid with something that would come due later. As he walked away, a wave of nausea rolled through me, sharp and unexpected, and I pressed my palm to my stomach, thinking only that in this house, even relief had consequences. The night Dominic said the vendetta was lifted, the estate sounded normal again, but my body refused to believe it. I tucked Lily into bed, smoothed her hair, and watched her chest rise and fall until my own breathing slowed. Even then, a sour wave of nausea rolled up my throat, and I blamed it on adrenaline and too much coffee. Stress had been living in my muscles for days, and now it was leaving behind tremors and dizzy flashes like aftershocks. I made a mug of chamomile tea, let it cool on the counter, then forgot it existed because my head felt stuffed with cotton. Every time the hallway creaked, I pictured Trish alone in a hospital room, and Lily asleep upstairs, and my mind started counting threats again. That was when Gabe appeared at my door with the kind of politeness that isn't really a choice. He didn't touch me, didn't raise his voice, just made it clear Dominic wanted me in the library alone. I checked Lily one more time, kissed her forehead, and told myself I was walking away from her for 5 minutes, not forever. Still, my hands shook as I followed Gabe down the hall. The library lights were low, the fireplace unlit, the room arranged like a private confession booth. Dominic had chosen the chair closest to the window where moonlight cut across his cuffs and turned his face into angles. He gestured for me to sit, and the calm in that gesture tightened my skin more than any shouted threat could have. I sat because Lily was upstairs, because Trish was still tethered to his money, because my courage had turned into a mother's math. Dominic looked at me for a long beat as if he was listening to my pulse, then he laid out what a doctor had found. He said the tests were ordered after I'd been pale and sick, and that the result came back positive. Pregnant. The word didn't land like language, it landed like gravity. My hearing dulled, the library blurred at the edges, and my lungs forgot the rhythm they'd practiced all week. I put my hand on my stomach without thinking, as if I could stop time with my palm. My first thought wasn't romance or wonder, it was Lily's face, and how many ways a new baby could shatter the fragile balance I'd built for her. My second thought was Trish, and the cold fear that I'd never be free of this house if I was carrying Dominic's child. I tried to tell myself mistakes happen, bodies misread calendars, stress imitates symptoms. Then I looked at Dominic's face and saw something that cracked me open. He wasn't startled. He wasn't scrambling to confirm dates or asking if I was sure. He looked steady, almost settled, like the world had finally clicked into the position he wanted. That lack of surprise was the sharpest thing in the room. It told me this wasn't an accident that happened to us, it was an outcome that happened for him. When he finally explained himself, he wrapped it in soft words about safety, legacy, and making me untouchable. I heard something else underneath the cold structure of a plan. He had ensured it, he admitted, because he wanted a bond that couldn't be negotiated away. Not money, not contracts, not promises, but my body itself becoming proof. My face went hot with fury, then cold with a kind of grief I didn't have a name for. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. He had taken my ability to say yes or no about a future that would touch Lily's life every single day. I'd walked into this arrangement thinking I could keep my child separate, that I could pay the price in private. Now the chain ran through my blood. I felt my hands curl into fists, felt my heartbeat slam against my ribs, and all I could think was that a mother's choices are the only shelter she truly owns. Dominic's calm didn't break, and that was its own kind of violence, the way certainty can pin you to the floor without a hand on your skin. I stood up on legs that didn't feel like mine and backed away until the bookshelf pressed against my shoulder blades. I needed distance air, something that wasn't his voice shaping my reality. In the doorway, I glanced toward the stairs toward Lily, and my anger sharpened into a promise that I would protect her even if I had to fight the man protecting us. I left the library shaking, throat tight, stomach turning, telling myself I could hate him for this, should hate him for this. But as I walked back to my room, one terrifying truth followed me like footsteps. No matter how it began, I was going to love that baby, and Dominic knew it already. By the time I reached my room, my hands were still shaking. I splashed cold water on my face and listened for Lily's breathing. Motherhood does not pause for betrayal. It just asks you to keep moving while your heart is splitting. I checked on Lily, watched her sleep, and let the sight of her small fingers curled around her blanket remind me what I was fighting for. Then the rage came back, sharp and clean, like a blade I could finally hold. Dominic's calm certainty had followed me out of the library, trying to settle over me like a heavy coat. I could not let it. I walked back downstairs on legs that felt borrowed, not because I wanted a scene, but because silence would turn into surrender. The house was so quiet it felt like it was listening. He was still there, waiting, as if time belonged to him. The room smelled like leather and paper and that smoke that always clung to him. I kept my voice steady in my head, even when my throat wanted to close. I didn't need to shout to be dangerous. I needed to be clear. I needed him to understand that my body was not another wing of his estate. In my memory, the confrontation plays like a contained storm. I remember telling him, without pretty words, that I wanted a choice before my life was rearranged. I remember naming the things he took when he ensured a permanent bond: consent, autonomy, the ability to leave if I ever had to protect my child from him as much as from his enemies. I remember the way my stomach turned when I realized how every path back to freedom had been narrowed on purpose. I also remember how my mind kept snapping upstairs to Lily. Even while I was furious, I was counting the distance to her room, picturing her waking up alone, imagining her hearing raised voices. That fear kept me controlled. It turned my anger into something disciplined. I laid out the leverage he used, even if he never called it leverage. Trish's treatment, the money, the gates, the guards, the fortress safety that had started to feel like confinement. Dominic did not react like a normal man. He stayed calm, patient, as if I was describing weather. I understood his worldview through the way he carried himself. In his mind, love and possession blurred until they were the same thing. Security was achieved through control, not trust. Vulnerability was a risk he refused to take, so he built cages and called them shelter. Permanence, to him, was kindness because it prevented loss. He would rather be hated than uncertain. That logic might have sounded like devotion in a different story, and that was what made me feel sick, because part of me had felt cared for here. The food when I was starving, the way my mom's paperwork got handled like it mattered, the way Lily had been protected from chaos outside these walls. Those moments were real, and the manipulation poisoned them. It turned every tender act into a receipt I never agreed to pay. I demanded boundaries, not as a plea but as a rule. I needed time to process what he had done. I needed space inside my own head, away from his decisions and his men and his constant watch. And I needed one future promise carved into stone. No more choices about my life made without my input. I wanted partnership, not ownership. I wanted to be heard before I was handled. He acknowledged that he had hurt me, but he would not unravel himself in regret. In my recollection, his intent stayed firm. He framed what he did as necessity, as protection, as the only way to keep me and the children safe in a world that hunted weakness. He did not offer the kind of apology that would release me. He offered certainty, and that only tightened my grief. When I finally stepped back, I felt trapped and strangely lucid. I could not undo the pregnancy. I could not pretend I would not love the baby growing inside me, because love is what I do, even when it costs me. But I also saw the next danger with painful clarity. If I didn't fight for my voice now, his protection would keep tightening until there was no air left. I went upstairs again, slower this time, and stood outside Lily's door like a guard of my own. In the quiet, one thought settled into me like a decision. I needed grounding outside Dominic's narrative. I needed my mother. Trish had always been able to look at a beautiful lie and see the price tag dangling from it, and I could already picture her eyes on Dominic, measuring love, control, sacrifice, and the cost, without anyone needing to explain a thing. Trish sat in my passenger seat like she was trying to pretend this was just another doctor's appointment. Her scarf hid most of her hair, and the sunlight caught the faint hollows under her cheekbones. Remission had given her breath back, not the years the disease stole, and I felt both grateful and ashamed every time I looked at her. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, because if I loosened them, I might start shaking again. At the hospital, everything had smelled like sanitizer and plastic and stale coffee. At the Bellini Estate, the air changed before we even reached the gate, like the world held its breath. A black SUV rolled behind us, and another waited ahead. Men in suits didn't stare, but I felt their attention slide over the car, over Trish, over me. The iron gates opened in slow silence, and my stomach twisted because I had dragged my mother into a place where silence meant rules. I watched Trish take it in, and I tried to imagine what she was seeing. Not the fountains or the perfect hedges, but the way the guards shifted their weight, the way staff stepped aside without being asked, the way cameras were tucked into corners like quiet insects. Trish had lived through a hard marriage, a hard divorce, and harder nights counting pills and rent. She knew the difference between comfort and control. I could feel her reading this place the way she used to read my face when I lied about being fine. Dominic met us in the front hall, not with warmth but with presence. He stood a half step too close to me, close enough that anyone watching would understand where I belonged. His suit looked effortless, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady on my mother. I felt him measuring her the way he measured everything, deciding what could hurt him and what couldn't. Trish didn't flinch. She looked up at him like she was looking at a storm from a porch, calm because she had survived storms before. I didn't need words to know what Trish understood. Her gaze flicked to the men posted near the doors, to the subtle way Mrs. DeLuca hovered like a judge, to the way Dominic's attention kept returning to me even when he was being polite. Trish's eyes softened when they landed on my face, and that softness hit harder than any accusation. It said, "I see the bargain you made." It said, "I know you did it for love." And it also said, "Love shouldn't require you to disappear." Lily came down the stairs with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, and the whole house seemed to change around her. Trish's posture loosened, and Lily ran straight to her like she'd been holding her breath all day. Watching them together was like hearing a familiar song in a strange city. Lily leaned into my mom's chest, safe in a way she wasn't with guards or gates. I realized then that my daughter knew exactly where home lived, and it wasn't in marble or money. It was in the arms that didn't ask her to perform. Later, I took Trish to the back garden, where the roses looked too perfect to be real. We sat on a bench that felt colder than it should have, and I finally let the truth come out in the only way I could. Not details, not a timeline, but the shape of it. I told her I accepted help because I was drowning, because Lily needed stability, because I couldn't watch my mother fade while I counted pennies. I told her the money saved her life, and that gratitude had been a rope around my ribs. Then I admitted the part that still made me taste metal. The pregnancy wasn't an accident, and the choice wasn't mine. Trish listened without interrupting, and in her silence I felt something steadier than comfort. She didn't push me toward panic. She didn't tell me to run without a plan. In my memory, her advice came like a North Star, simple and impossible to argue with. Love can be messy, she reminded me, and people can carry broken parts they never asked for. But control cannot be the only language in a family. If Dominic wanted to build a future with me, he had to learn to speak in honesty, not strategy. And if I stayed, it had to be because I chose it. Day after day, with my eyes open. Back inside, Dominic stayed controlled, but Trish's gaze had left a thin crack in him. He watched me like he could feel my boundaries forming. The house still moved in quiet obedience, yet the air felt charged. Trish went upstairs to rest, Lily clinging to her. I lingered in the hall, sensing Dominic coming, not with another rule, but a confession at last. After my mom left for her guest room, the estate felt changed, like even the chandeliers listened for footsteps tonight. Trish's calm had steadied me, but the pregnancy and the betrayal still sat in my chest like stone all day. Dominic moved quieter too, not softer, just unsettled, as if her eyes had pulled a thread in him at last. He brought me to the library, doors closed, fire low, my daughter asleep upstairs with a guard outside her hall. I remember thinking how careful he was with privacy, and how that care could still be another form of control. He didn't offer excuses. He offered pieces of himself, as if he'd decided hiding was finally riskier than truth now. He let me see where his fear started, back when he was a boy watching cancer take his mother slowly. He described hospitals in clipped fragments, the smell, the waiting, the way hope becomes a math problem you lose anyway. In memories, his father hardened into a man who bought safety with power, because grief had made tenderness feel useless. Dominic learned early that love is a target, and that losing someone once teaches you to never gamble again, ever. When Trish got better, he felt the clock start ticking, and he imagined me walking away with my freedom too. He admitted he chose certainty over respect, because he couldn't stand another ending he didn't control with his own hands. Hearing it didn't unbreak me, but it made the wound make sense, which is a cruel kind of clarity sometimes. I held two truths at once, that he hurt me, and that his panic was real enough to ruin us. That motive did not erase the violation, and I refused to let empathy become permission for what he stole already. So I told myself what Trish told me, that forever can't be a cage unless I agree it is first. If we were raising a child together, and keeping Lily safe, then honesty and consent had to become daily rules. I needed a voice in doctors, schedules, money, and security, because my kids deserve a mother who chooses every time. Dominic couldn't promise he would stop protecting, but he agreed to be challenged, and to listen before acting from now. What moved me was not an apology, but the way he accepted discomfort, like a man learning pain isn't defeat. Over the next weeks, my nausea got worse, and I stopped pretending stress was the only reason my body shook. He arranged appointments and rides, but I kept my eyes open, reminding myself that care doesn't cancel accountability ever again. When cravings hit at odd hours, he sent soup or fruit, then waited outside the door like he was guarding. I noticed he stopped gripping my life with invisible hands, and started asking, even when asking cost him pride daily. I kept Lily's routine sacred: breakfast, schoolwork, bedtime stories, because children learn love from the hours you repeat each night. Dominic tried with her in small ways, not grand gifts, just patience, respect, and letting her say no to him. Trish's doctor confirmed remission again, and the leverage that started this nightmare loosened, one steady breath at a time, finally. At an ultrasound, the tiny heartbeat turned my anger into something quieter, because I already cared about that life inside. Later, when I felt the first flutter, I cried in the bathroom, hating the beginning and loving the future anyway. Nothing became perfect, and I never pretended it did, but partnership started replacing the silent captivity I feared the most. Dominic stayed intense, but now he was exposed, and that exposure made him accountable in ways power never did before. One afternoon, Lily laughed in the garden. Trish watched from a chair, and I held my belly in sunlight quietly. Dominic's hand rested at my back, protective but not gripping, and I felt the difference like fresh air at once. Forever used to sound like locked doors, and now it sounded like a word I was defining with my rules. I learned that protection can become partnership only when the protected person is allowed to speak and be heard fully. If you've ever felt trapped by help, you know the confusion, the gratitude, the anger, all tangled together like wire. I'm still healing, still watching, still choosing, because love doesn't excuse harm, and family deserves better than fear every day. So that's where my story rests. Not in fantasy, but in boundaries, honesty, and the courage to demand change always. If this journey moved you, please like the video, share it with someone, and subscribe for more stories from me. And tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place when choice and survival collide hard. Do you believe protection can become partnership, or does it always turn into a claim, no matter how it looks?